Welcome back to another edition of Bad News, the media criticism show the right deserves. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
All right, on today's show, we have three topics. The first is going to be the lies surrounding Officer Brian Sicknick's tragic death. We're then going to go into Marty Barron's comments about the Washington Post's lack of bias. Believe me, you're going to want to hear what he said. And we finally have a little bit of good news to share with you on bad news. But for our first segment, that's sort of our teaser for the end, so you'll stick around to have your spirits lifted. For our first segment, I'm going to kick it over to Ben to talk about what we know, about the media's terrible coverage of what happened to Officer Sicknick.
Yeah, in their rush to judge the Capitol riot as an event that could be used to smear and target half the country, as I've argued on this show and in writing at the Federalist and Newsweek, perhaps the central data point that was used to turn the Capitol riot into what our purported representatives have likened to 9/11 or Pearl Harbor was to argue that Officer Sicknick, one of the 5 people who died in relation to what happened that day, not as a direct consequence necessarily in 4 of the 5 cases, as we now appear to know, that he was essentially bashed over the head with a fire extinguisher and killed by bloodthirsty MAGA rioters. That was the portrayal of what transpired that day. And of course, his life was honored in Washington, D.C., in the Capitol. This actually made it into the article of impeachment because they talk about the fact that people were killed as a consequence of the riot and even more directly linked to it. All of a sudden now, in the weeks since Officer Sicknick's death, which has been weaponized and exploited in sickening fashion, now all of a sudden the media is walking it back. The New York Times was the publication that originally printed that 2 law enforcement sources, which of course could be anyone in Washington, D.C., or outside, ascribed his death to being bashed in the head with a fire extinguisher brutally. Then all of a sudden we saw that story start to unravel. There was not any medical records indicating as such that could be revealed. We heard that he died of complications having nothing to do with actually what transpired that day. Now the New York Times has retracted their story at the same time in a very soft sense, by the way, even though it was the central lie, or at least not corroborated assertion that went round the world and again made it into the article of impeachment. Now suddenly they're retracting it in soft fashion. FBI Director Christopher Wray yesterday would not confirm or deny anything about what transpired in terms of Officer Sicknick's death. So once again, of the 5 people who perished associated with the Capitol riots in any way, only one of them that we know of died as a direct consequence of the storming of the Capitol, and that was Ashley Babbitt. And there were very few, if any, questions about that, incidentally, on Capitol Hill yesterday during that hearing in which FBI Director Wray spoke. So this is once again an example of media malpractice having massive, humongous policy consequences. And I guess my question is, Emily, is anyone going to retract this in a forceful way? Or is it that once the lie goes out there, or at least the not corroborated truth, and it starts to fall apart, it doesn't matter? Whoever says the first story ultimately casts the narrative, and that narrative cannot be destroyed.
Journalists like to say they're writing the first draft of history, but they need to do a better job at writing that first draft, right? Because to some extent, it's completely understandable that you get things wrong here or there. What I want to know is how on earth the New York Times had two sources on this initial report about how Officer Sicknick tragically passed away. It is insane to me that they had 2 sources, anonymous sources, that gave them that bit of information that, from what we now know, was so completely off the mark because Officer Sicknick was texting his brother that day. I have no idea. I mean, January 6th was a frenzied, crazy day, of course, but to cite 2 people anonymously that are giving you such terrible information, I have no idea who these people are. I also have no idea how they were so dramatically off base from what actually happened. This is a situation where you would think the New York Times would perhaps want to burn those sources because they gave them such egregiously bad information. It's not even as though they ascribed something that happened to one person to another other person. As far as we know, nobody died of being bludgeoned with a fire extinguisher. So to have that information at all is just wild that they, had two anonymous sources that gave them this information, and they have yet to actually explain how that happened. That's unbelievable to me. And you're right. Your central point here is essential, which is that when you write that first draft of history, a lot of times it's what settles into everybody's mind, and it stays there once it happened. This is now the deadly insurrection, and this misreporting helped them sort of build that narrative. And of course, what happened was disgusting. We've said it a million times. It was horrible. I was there reporting it and had to leave. I was so disgusted by what I saw. But that's the sad thing to me, is that we have the reality that's bad enough. To exploit it for political ends is just so much worse. And I don't even know if this is stemming from the agenda so much as it's stemming from the just incompetence of outlets that used to have different standards and that used to be sort of the gem of international media. But the central question for me is literally how this ever happened from how did two anonymous sources get this so wrong that the New York Times ran with it?
You make a great point that it's tough to know sometimes whether it's nefarious acts or incompetence that leads to these disastrous results. And this is, of course, from one of the two main papers of Russiagate, the other being the Washington Post, and the paper of Walter Duranty, as I always like to remind people as well. So there's a long history of this, but it's so irresponsible. It's the height of irresponsibility. And I don't think the Times cares, because I don't think they expect to be called on it ultimately. But you're right, two law enforcement sources. This is a day that was documented with so many cell phones, where you have law enforcement rifling through the records, including private companies turning over private records of individuals, of everyone who was there that day, and all the cell phone signals that were there. And yet you can't get a clear answer as to what transpired. And oh, by the way, no one in law enforcement actually close to this leaked the truth about it. It calls into question the narrative immediately that there weren't a whole raft of sources reporting this, and that we didn't get the medical records immediately. The fact that the Capitol Police also reported one thing originally, and then I believe sort of seemed to walk it back as well. It all points to the fact that this unraveled. If Officer Sicknick was killed in brutal fashion, one would have expected there to be probably video evidence of it at a minimum, or if nothing else, his family on TV calling for justice. I mean, you can think of all the ways that this would have been played had the narrative that the New York Times ran with been actually true, and you would have seen it within minutes, days of what transpired. So once again, this is just the horrible exploitation and leveraging of a death, because ultimately people seem to be political props for our media, not individuals. And as a consequence of this, of course, it feeds this entire narrative that's trying to make the country hysterical about those evil wrong thinkers. And what are the odds that the New York Times wins an award for its reporting on the Capitol riots? I could see it being pretty high. They won it for Russiagate, never paid a consequence. Until there's a consequence to be paid, ultimately this is going to continue. It's a disaster for the country.
Yeah, you're right. And it's exactly the kind of thing that as people hear about it, people whose jobs aren't, they're privileged enough that their job isn't sort of obsessively following the media like it is for us. When they hear sort of things like this, it's what makes them mistrust the media. And they're absolutely right to mistrust the media. Again, I understand, they're writing the first draft of history and they're the real firefighters of our politics, but they need to do a much better job taking that first draft seriously, because a mistake this huge, it's hard to fathom how supposedly the top paper in the country was able to make it. And with that, let's actually go to one of the other purported top papers of the country. I'm going to play a clip here from outgoing Washington Post, I think editor-in-chief Marty Barron, who was talking to our favorite person in the world, Brian Steller.
There's also this notion that we're somehow ideologically attached to a party, the Democratic Party. And that's not true. We are completely independent. We held the Obama administration to account. We fully expect to hold the Biden administration to account. And we're just not a branch of any party. The Trump administration tried to describe us as the opposition party, but they did that for their own political purposes, not because that reflects reality.
Barron says he's not looking for a new full-time job now, but will remain involved.
Brian Stelter liked that answer, but I'm going to kick it over to you. But I want to say first that Marty Baron, who is the outgoing executive editor of the Washington Post, and that was a clip from this weekend, he is absolutely correct that they're not a branch of a political party. They're a branch of an ideology. This is so much bigger than Democrats and Republicans. This is about the cultural left, and that is what the Washington Post is absolutely a representative of. Do you think, Ben, that the Washington Post, that Marty Baron is correct to say that they held the Obama administration to account, just the same way they did with Trump?
They coined that moniker, democracy dies in darkness, in response to one thing and one thing alone, and that was Donald Trump being elected the president of the United States. So it's a joke from the start, from the header of the paper. The top of the paper itself tells you that it is a mouthpiece of leftism in general, and the Democrat Party in particular. And we don't even need to go into all the contrast in reporting of Obama versus Trump and the just constant vitriolic attacks on President Trump and efforts to delegitimize him and everything that he stands for and everyone who ever supported him or associated with him. On the one hand, there's just the shameless shilling for a paper, which anyone might be prone to if they worked at a place for several decades and felt great pride in the work that they had done on behalf of that publication. On the other hand, could it actually be that he believes what he's saying? Maybe he does. And if he actually does believe what he's saying, that speaks to even more just how out of touch our ruling class really is. People get ensconced in Washington, D.C., and they want to be accepted at the cocktail parties there, obviously. And you see it with people, Republican congressmen, for example, who go to D.C. and act like conservatives and talk like conservatives. And then within a year, they're basically rhinos. And you probably see it among Democrats, too. They all want to be liked and feted at the same events and treated with respect in the right circles with the right people in Washington, D.C. And the Washington Post has to be thought of as an organ of that very culture. And to say you're independent, you think that Jeff Bezos is independent? Do you think any of the writers at the Washington Post themselves consider themselves independent? Again, maybe they do, but that just speaks to a myopia and a delusional perspective on things. It would have been accurate for him to say, look, we represent what Washington, D.C. stands for. And that is why, by the way, to go back to our first segment, this chasm between half the country and then the very small percentage of the country that actually exists in the rarefied air of newsrooms like the Washington Post, that's why there's so much anger and people are so pissed because of how out of touch that ruling class is and how non-responsive to the rest of the country it is. So I guess my question to you is, you probably know some of the journalists at the Washington Post. Do you think that they think of themselves as actually independent, or will they recognize, at least when the cameras aren't on and they're not in writing, that, yeah, of course they're partisans and they have their ideological perspective, and it's acceptable because that's where Washington and newspapers like the Washington Post are?
I love that question. They absolutely think of themselves as independent. Marty Baron believes every single thing that he just said, and that's why they're incapable of fixing any of it, because they are so entrenched in this notion that what they're doing is journalism without fear or favor. Now, something that's key is we did see an effort to actively dispense with the concept of objectivity and journalistic neutrality over the course of the summer, because they believe, for instance, you can't be objective and neutral when it comes to covering racists, and Donald Trump is a racist. Therefore, as the Huffington Post put at the end of every article before he was elected, Donald Trump is a xenophobic, racist bigot. I don't know if people remember it, but it's something that they did. So we have seen a movement among Beltway journalists and journalists in general to move away from the concept of objectivity and neutrality. That is a key trend to pay attention to. They're talking about it less now that Donald Trump's not in office, of course, as with so many other things, but they really genuinely believe in their own neutrality and their own objectivity. And that speaks to how deep their sort of total delusion about the state of affairs in this country is. Now, yeah, cameras are off. They're making fun of Republicans constantly and mocking conservatives constantly, sure, but they don't think of that as being partisan. They just think objectively Republicans are crazy. They really think like, oh, the objective reality is that Republicans are crazy and worth mocking. Therefore, we can do it because it's objective. Like, that's why this doesn't change. It's because they genuinely genuinely come from this sort of cultural worldview. And I think Coming Apart by Charles Murray is a really important book for media criticism, because a lot of the trends that he identifies and exposes are very applicable to the journalistic class. They don't really understand what goes on in the country. They can take their little parachute trips out to Kansas and report about X, Y, and Z, and then they leave. But they don't really understand. They don't understand how deep their cultural affiliations and their cultural preferences and even their geographic bubble affects the way that they see the world. And that's why this doesn't change, because they're incapable of saying, for instance, it is a reasonable position to be pro-life. It is a reasonable position to say the way Ralph Northam talked about babies is insane, but they come from a totally different background, and they don't, like, that's, to them, it's just nothing is reasonable that they disagree with.
Yeah, you're so right. They think that they're independent because the alternative is nuts and completely beyond the pale and can't be accepted. And I think the New York Times wrote about this, that essentially we can't treat Donald Trump as a normal figure, which means we can't treat half the country as being normal, because for them, it's not normal. It is abnormal, and it is radical, and leftism is the norm. So I kind of go back to this way to understand the world, which is that the elite is fringe in their views, but they think their views are mainstream and ought to be mainstream. And
Yes.
those across America who are treated as fringe actually have the mainstream views and think of the elites as fringe. And until and unless that balance changes, the country is in for dark days. There's just no way around it. And the media is the last group of people to actually break through here, because they're so myopic. They're part of it. They're just the mouthpiece.
Yeah.
How do you think we get around that? Is there any way around it? Like, we have this show, obviously, because we think that it's worth going out and exposing it for what it is, because it's the right thing to do, and maybe, just maybe, it'll cause people to be responsive to it. But what is the solution ultimately, besides getting a new elite?
I mean, yeah, right, impossible. The solution from my perspective is Substack and Patreon and all of it. And I don't know that that's going to solve the problem, but that's really the only way to do it at this point. I mean, I'm here at the National Journalism Center where I'm the director, and our job is to train young students to, enter the world of journalism as conservatives. And that's certainly a method that can help push back on a lot of this stuff. But I think, the new media that we're seeing rise is so important, because that gives people alternative channels. So the more that people are turning away from the New York Times and ABC News, and this is a horrifying thought for the media, by the way, and not just for financial reasons. They think, the more people listen to the Federalist, the more crazy and conspiracy addled they'll be. But the more that people are not getting their news from the New York Times and they're going to other outlets, the more those outlets will be able to build up the infrastructure to take over, to step into the vacuum that the New York Times and Washington Post are leaving. And that is really, we have to sort of support that infrastructure and drive people to that infrastructure. But that's my best answer to that very difficult question.
Well, on that note, I guess, should we transition to the good news of the week?
Yes, we have good news on bad news, courtesy of Ben. Ben highlighted this, and it's absolutely worth talking about. I am going to share my screen here. Ben, why don't you cue up the segment while I pull it up here?
Yeah, so I want to flag for once some good reporting from a mainstream figure, or at least the kind of adversarial journalism expressed towards the Democrat administration that you almost never see, and which is right on the merits, because it simply asks, here's the reality of a situation, here's what you claim, here's why it contradicts the truth, explain it to us. And the reporter in question is the AP's Matt Lee, Associated Press's Matt Lee, and he covers the State Department for the AP. About a week ago, he challenged Ned Price with respect to Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 being the gas pipeline that's being constructed between Russia and Germany, which will substantially increase energy output there. The Trump administration sought to block Nord Stream 2 with sanctions. Ned Price and the Biden administration took credit for over a dozen companies recently saying they will not continue to do work on Nord Stream 2. Matt Lee challenged him by saying, look, aren't you just taking credit for what the past administration pressured these companies to do for months upon months? And Ned Price didn't really have a great answer for it. Yesterday, or rather on March 1st, 2 days ago, Ned Price was again questioned by Matt Lee on a couple of different areas, and we'll go to the tapes to talk about the first one in just a second. And this is around the sanctions, this so-called Khashoggi ban of visa bans that were imposed upon dozens of Saudi government officials in response to the alleged murder of Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi government officials. So let's roll the tape.
Here it is.
Since Friday.
Okay. So over the weekend, I guess yesterday specifically, your White House colleague said that the reason, or one of the reasons, is that you traditionally, historically, don't impose sanctions on the leadership of countries with which you have diplomatic relations. Is that also your take on this?
I stand by what my colleague said.
Okay, but the reason I ask is that's just simply not true. I can give you a number of examples. I've written down there: Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Belarus, Myanmar. Even yesterday, the National Security Advisor threatened new sanctions on Myanmar's leadership. We can go to Sudan. All of these are countries with which the United States has diplomatic relations. We can look at Syria and Venezuela, places where the U.S. has suspended operations at its embassy, but has not severed diplomatic ties. All of those countries, the leaders have had sanctions imposed on them. So I don't understand how this is an argument.
Matt, what is also true is that there are countries around the world, and I need not name them, I'm sure they are familiar to you, with whom
the United States has historically not imposed sanctions on countries or the leaders of countries.
Matt, there are limited exceptions to that, but they are exceptional precisely because they are exceptions.
I just named 6 countries plus 2 that you closed down the embassies
Matt,
on, and
there are other countries, and I need not name them. You know them, with whom we have adversarial relationships or competitive relationships.
North Korea. But you don't have diplomatic relations with them. So that argument, I'm trying to get you to say that you acknowledge that argument is.
Matt,
is
I would rather not argue about a rather picayune point. I would rather talk about.
You might think that it's picayune, but I don't. And if you're going to go out and say that this is historically.
Okay, Ben. Yeah. Tell us what your takeaway was from that. You covered these issues closely. That was fantastic to watch.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's like hallelujah that for once someone in the media does what every single question was to the Trump administration, except actually on the merits of an issue here. And by the way, like I might even agree with the I do agree. Let me just say, I do agree with the administration not imposing sanctions on MBS as a consequence of what transpired. And that's neither here nor there, because the point is, here's a policy. You claim X about the policy, namely that it's standard to not sanction of heads of state, essentially, in response to atrocities that their regimes have committed. Here are examples of all the nations where you have sanctioned those heads of state. Why is Saudi Arabia different? And he can't give a response. Ned Price can't give a response. Again, I don't care what your position is on the issue. That's a legitimate question to ask. And it provides insight to an audience to understand what's the administration's thinking. If this is an exception, why is it an exception? And why do you claim one thing when it's clearly not true based upon the facts? That is what journalism is supposed to be. And it should be the same whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And Ned Price getting flustered and saying it's rather picayune is really something hilarious to watch. And he did this in a couple other places during this press briefing as well. And I grant that the way Matt Lee went about it, he has a reputation as sort of a curmudgeon, and he's been in those State Department briefings for, I think, a couple of decades or longer. So, look, there's a give and take here. And I wouldn't necessarily have taken the maybe sort of hostile or crotchety tone that he took. But good for him for asking an important question, just like he asked an important question about Nord Stream 2. And just like, incidentally, later in this press briefing, there's another back and forth where he's essentially saying, he being Matt Lee, look, the administration removed the terror designation from the Houthi group, which has been carrying out attacks on Saudis and others as well, and in particular in Yemen, Saudi-backed forces in Yemen. Okay, you just removed those designations, and now there have been all sorts of attacks carried out against the Saudis and others. Given that's the case, and you say that we're looking at ways to counter Saudi leadership or punish them for this, do you regret essentially taking off the terror designation? which is an obvious question that you should ask, and no administration should have a problem responding to something like that. And Ned Price goes, essentially, we can hold the Houthi leadership to account without leaving Yemen's civilian population in the rhetorical crossfire, which points to them saying we needed to take these sanctions off because innocent civilians were getting hurt, not just Houthi terrorists. Okay, and then so Matt Lee responds, and I quote here, and if I pull out my lighter, I can burn the straw man down that you just created. I'm talking about the specific designations of the leaders, not the foreign terrorist organization. They were removed at the same time as the designation. And now you're saying today that we're looking at additional ways to put pressure on the Houthi leadership. So are you saying now that you're considering putting them back on this list or not? So it really is, again, I wouldn't necessarily use that rhetoric, but he has sort of eminence in the room, Matt Lee, because he's been there for a couple of decades, and I'm sure he knows Ned Price and others in the administration personally. But again, this is actual journalism. It's to point out hypocrisy or curious positions taken that don't comport with stated policies or the like. This is journalism. This is good news. This is what it's supposed to look like, no matter what the administration is. So I'm curious as to your take on that back and forth as someone who interviews figures for a living as well. What do you make of this?
Yeah, you mentioned that he's sort of curmudgeonly, and when I'm watching this clip, I'm like, this is exactly the kind of person that journalists used to be, sort of like wrinkled and angry and hostile to everyone. Like, it doesn't matter. You just have this disdain, this instinctual disdain for people in powerful positions because you know instinctually that you shouldn't trust them, and that more likely than not, they're spinning and lying to advance an agenda. And that's what journalists used to be. They didn't used to be camera ready, Harvard graduates, and I don't know his academic background, but they didn't used to be camera ready, fancy, white collar, upper middle class kids who want to talk about the word Latinx. Like, they used to be hard and, like rumpled and not camera ready and just ready to pound people with questions without fear or favor. And so I think that the sort of curmudgeonly aspect of this is what brings me joy, because that's exactly what reporters, it's the attitude, it's the sentiment that they should bring to everything. They shouldn't want to be people who are parading around in fancy suits to get interviews on cable news. They should be people who just want to get their questions answered because that's what's good for the country, because they have the privilege of holding the powerful to account, because the rest of the country has regular jobs. They're not in Washington. They're not able to hold the powerful to account. They don't have the access. And so that's what we do. We have part of our economy is journalism, and people go into the field, and their essential role in our society is to hold the powerful people to account, because they're probably trying to pull a fast one in 9 times out of 10. And so to watch that, it's great, but it's also such a stark contrast with what we have now. Jim Acosta, for instance, to take one person, he asked some tough questions of President Obama. And then when the Trump administration came along, you had people like Jim Acosta and like Yamiche Alcindor, who tried to make a name for themselves by being openly hostile, and then congratulated themselves for having that sort of like hostility to the government and holding truth to power and being the fourth estate. But we're already seeing what a joke that was. Because they don't have this like instinctual bipartisan contempt for people in positions of power who are almost always trying to lie to you. And that's such a critical element of what makes a journalist. And I live in DC and know a lot of journalists, and I just don't see that anymore. And I don't always see it on the right as much as I should either. I mean, you should expect that you're being lied to. You should be distrustful, and you should come with that sort of hostility for people in power. And it's lost. I don't know if it's the fault of cable news. I don't know who's to blame, but it's definitely not getting any better.
Yeah, and I mean, look, there's also this aspect that's the tough part of a media job if you're really trying to do it appropriately, which is, on the one hand, you want access to people. On the other hand, if you ask them difficult questions, they're likely to cut you off. So your job is to glean those nuggets and actually press people on the merits of certain policy issues. But then you have the challenge of, okay, you just blew up this person and they're going to get a talking to from their boss in the government. And consequently, you may lose access. And that's the challenge of the job. And if were we in a better place societally, there'd be an understanding that this person in the media is doing their job. They're trying to do it in a level-headed and calm and sober and objective fashion, but that's not where people are. That's not where the media is. And certainly the politicians want to do what's best for their own self-interest when it comes to these briefings, which is namely to get the party line out. I do think there's also a point to be made here, a very fine distinction between being hostile on a personal basis and engaging in ad hominem and just hostility at a guttural, personal level versus questioning intensely and seriously and being hostile on the issue itself. And in this case, it was clear that it was on the issues themselves, even though there may be more to it than that as well that we don't know about. But I think it's really important to note that we ought to be hostile on the merits, and you should assume bad faith, but ask questions in good faith as the other person seeks to portray them. And that, by the way, should win plaudits. I mean, it doesn't, unfortunately, because people are not rewarded for that. But being sober, cool, even-handed, asking questions on the merits without hostility, without hysteria and emotion in one's voice is the right way to go for the public, for doing your job, and for how you're portrayed as an individual itself. But of course, our media is completely on the other side of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a tough balancing act because you do have to get access in order to hold people accountable. You do actually have to be able to have conversations with them, but journalists should have the reputation that they're fair. And that's how you get the best access. I mean, of course, people who are fawning get amazing access, but they're also totally taken advantage of by both parties, by Republicans and Democrats, who use them to sort of leak information that they know will be treated less critically than it should be, and to sort of pad their press releases and float them out into the public, again, without the sort of due skepticism or criticism. And yeah, I mean, super friendly reporters, I think, get exploited by both parties. That's the job of the party, and it's not the job of the reporter. So I think people need to have reputations as being fair journalists. And that's just, nobody's really interested in being fair. They want the facade of fairness, but they can't actually do the work. And that goes into what we've been talking about this entire episode, is that they just have sort of cultural perspectives that prevent them from seeing that they're not neutral and they're not objective. They're ultimately just leftists.
Yeah, and to circle back to our starting point on the Officer Sicknick death, what should the media have done in that situation? Ask probing questions. If you get conflicting views on them, report all the views as to what transpired, because we still don't actually know what happened to Officer Sicknick. So don't run that story first. But of course, there's a rush to get the first story out. And consequently, it leads to horrible consequences for society, the stigmatizing of half the country and targeting and smearing them. And that points to the fact that there was politics in it, because there was not sobriety and actually asking very probing questions of numerous people involved before reporting something like that, which then becomes the truth and the official narrative, and then in subsequent days appears to fall apart. And we look forward to real reporting on what actually transpired in toto, in terms of the entire Capitol riots. Hopefully some oversight in Congress helps with that. But on the media side, it seems rather hopeless. But at least we can present some good news here, and hopefully in future episodes, some good news as well.
Some good news on bad news. I love it. Well, stay tuned for the next edition of Bad News. We will be back soon with more. We're a production of The Federalist, sponsored by the National Journalism Center. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
See you next time.